how do you make information matter? When climate scientists realize, oh, you mean just having the information doesn't make people change? And the social scientists are like, how could you possibly think that just shoveling data into somebody's brain is going to make them change?
Welcome to Climate Check, Stories and Solutions for Fighting Climate Change. We are a part of 350 Brooklyn, an organization that strives to counter the climate crisis through local action. We work toward a world that is just, equitable, and sustainable, and where all beings can thrive. You might notice there's a new voice behind this mic. I'm Brynn Fuller-Becker. I'll be filling in for Eva Dean as your host today. I'm a Brooklyn-based climate advocate, a Climate Check alum, and the Communications and Advocacy Manager for New Yorkers for Clean Power, a collaborative campaign advancing equitable climate solutions across New York. On this episode, we're asking, where has the media been and where is it now in covering the ever-growing climate crisis? Our guest is Andy Revkin, a seasoned environmental journalist, author, and the founding director of the Initiative on Communication and Sustainability at Columbia University's Earth Institute. Andy has written on climate change for more than 30 years, reporting from the North Pole to the White House, the Amazon rainforest to the Vatican, for major publications such as the New York Times, ProPublica, and National Geographic. Hi, Andy. Welcome to Climate Check.
It's really good to be here.
As a fellow climate communicator, I'm really excited to dive into today's conversation with you. To start off, would you mind introducing yourself?
I'm Andy Revkin. I'm a journalist. I've been working on sustainability questions for 41 years. Also a musician. I live in Maine now on the coast, and I think about these problems every day.
What was your spark into this world of writing? What was one of the first things that drew you to covering these types of topics as they first emerged? How would you tell your climate story?
I got a biology degree as an undergrad. I got out into the world through a fellowship that led me to some unusual places, came back wanting to be a journalist. Because I had a biology degree and because I loved science and the environment, the first things I was focusing on were the environment. And then along comes 1988, and I wouldn't say fixated, but it became clear that global warming was a big deal. That summer, I wrote a cover story for Discover magazine, and onward from there. But that came after a string of what I'd say are more conventional pollution stories: acid rain, the ozone depletion through chlorofluorocarbons, the clean air problems, smog and soot. And so when this issue came into the headlines, it felt like a pollution story, meaning we need a law, treaties, let's cut these gases, just like CFC's CO2, what's the difference? It was clear, though, even as I was reporting that story, that CO2, carbon dioxide, the main greenhouse gas, and dynamics of the energy needs of humanity made global warming very different than more traditional, quote unquote, environmental stories.
I want to hear a little bit more about the work that you've done at Columbia, which I understand has focused on bridging the gaps between what the scientists know and understand and then what the consumers are reading, listening to, and watching.
Yeah, I started this initiative at Columbia. It ran for 4 years. My goal in this project was to focus on something I also focused on at Pace University when I was there. How do you make information matter? It's one thing to have science over here in this box. It's one thing to have society over here. And the social sciences, which are in a whole different box from like climate science, those scientists don't talk to each other. And you end up with these shocking revelations when climate scientists realize, oh, you mean just having the information doesn't make people change? To them, that's like, why doesn't this work? I'm angry. And the social scientists are like, how could you possibly think that just shoveling data into somebody's brain is going to make them change? So a lot of what I tried to do was not just to think about how to tell a better story, but how do you have across the disciplines and between the disciplines and communities at risk, how do you get them all to talk to each other in ways that stick? The lessons are you need sustained engagement between expertise and communities if you want to have any hope of building the trust and understanding that can generate transitions.
Yeah, the idea of sustained engagement feels like something that's a little bit counterintuitive to our present media right now, which is so focused on attention and clicks. So off of that point, a lot of the climate comms work that I do is focused around finding case studies. And this comes from an understanding of, the immense power of storytelling and showing people too that some of the ideas, some of the things that we're advocating for aren't these far-fetched future ideals, but are actually real tangible things that are happening right now. What do you see as some opportunities for journalists and for media to weave climate into the stories that they're already telling?
Look at the landscape that exists now, and you see the infrastructure law, which is like $1 trillion, a big chunk of it related to energy. And I interviewed Jigar Shah, who's the head of the big loan program that's managing a lot of this money. And he says the challenge now isn't money and stuff. We have all that stuff. We have all kinds of loans and grants and money to give to communities to change their light bulbs, to change their bus fleets, to do all this stuff. He said what we need is someone in each of those communities to be the aware local voice at a town meeting or at the school board meeting who gets some little spark going about saving money with changing the street lights to LEDs, and it happens, and you have a local story about that, and you have the budget benefits of that happening. That can then ramify and spread to other communities in ways that I think can swamp the long-term potential of conventional media approaches. I see the story more being one of information sharing more than storytelling.
A huge part of that is trust, right? People need to trust the people that are sharing the information, that are making the case for a lot of these changes.
Yeah, this is a real different model from what we, meaning journalists or communicators at organizations, used to think was the task at hand. Nancy Holt, a young science policy person, has been running this thing called Sci for New York. She's trying to get scientists, young climate scientists, people at Columbia or NYU, or to go to town meetings, to go to their borough hall meetings, to just understand the ecosystem of change in their communities, to become a voice. When someone asks, what do we do about X? If you're a scientist and you're in the room, you could actually say, well, I'm a scientist, I know about X. That's another way forward too, is connecting scientists with their communities. So they're not just sitting on their campuses writing grants.
I think the flip side of that is listening, right? You have to be good at talking, but they also have to be good at listening. Can you tell us about a time that you or someone else that you've seen did a really good job at meeting their audience where they are?
There were organizations that in the Midwest and Minnesota started these dialogues called rural climate dialogues and rural energy dialogues. These are in very conservative or at least very mixed communities. And they start with what community questions are about climate or extreme weather, the like, and then build forward toward clarity on what we would need to do to have a better relationship with our climate system. How do you build resilience? Or on the same thing on energy. And those models, one key there is facilitation. There are people who help to manage discussions. It's rare to find a scientist who has done all the training you'd need to do to be the expert in the social science as well as in their discipline. There's no magic sauce here that you can just sort of spread around and immediately have a better, more productive conversation. It's a process, it's a dynamic, it's a sustained engagement pathway. So the community facing chronic flooding in Ohio starts to understand both the past of flooding, the future of flooding with climate change, and the policy choices and investments they can make. What's good about it is it's not a single person with a single voice, with a single story or a single way of demystifying things. It's a community, including the community of expertise and the community at risk. But what I see is the overall dynamic is the thing that's vital. Some kind of sustained engagement. some kind of relationship building between expertise and communities, some facilitator, someone who's an interface. When you have those things, you can start to really change. And none of that is easy.
Are scientists excited to help with this stuff, or do they have hesitancy around it?
I think some are hesitant, but I think a bigger issue is they simply don't have the capacity or time, especially young scientists. You have to publish or perish, right? And that leads to, writing marginally useful papers that are just like within their field of climate dynamics or something. And to do papers that are interdisciplinary and really can push frontiers along the lines we're describing takes more time. And you're not incentivized for that because you got to rush to get your career track and your tenure track on board. I guess that takes me back to something that's come up a few times in our chat is this isn't easy. And it's all kind of incremental and all kind of long term. And that feels really kind of paralytic until you realize that if you can make an incremental change, if you can communicate that to someone in the adjacent town, or if you're a young researcher and you can say, hey, I went to a town meeting, it was really interesting. I didn't really know how laws get passed here. The person to person stuff can start to add up. And if you add it up across 8 billion people, then that becomes a real driver of change at the level that makes me confident I can be an old man and not worry so much.
One of the things that you talked about when you spoke on a 350 Brooklyn panel in March 2021 was on the idea of where our current media is now and the roles of the fossil fuel industry in that space. Coverage like The Daily covering climate issues and then having an ad by Exxon or BP literally right after that story is being told. How can we work to pressure these media conglomerates to get big oil out of their spaces, out of their ad spaces, and ultimately out of our journalism?
It's really hard. I wrote a piece a couple of years ago punishing the New York Times, where I worked for, I wrote for the Times for 21 years in different capacities. The thing that bugged me there was when the Times has a subsidiary, a business that creates content for money, and they were doing stuff with Shell and the like. I talked off the record with the publisher of the New York Times at the time, and I understand the bind that news media are in because essentially we have a generation now with online communication that think that information is free and that journalists just sort of magically produce information and that anyone is a journalist who has a camera. That environment is killing the media.
So do you think the part of the solution then is independent platforms for journalism like Substack?
I'm newish to Substack. It's basically a newsletter platform. That's what they think of it as. I think of it as a blog. I think having the capacity to have people doing communication like I do now on Substack and others do is great. The idea you can have a niche and be financially supported. Emily Atkin and David Roberts have shown that in this arena you can do that, and that's great. The problem there is those are niche audiences, and you're only talking to people who are already engaged with your issue. And that's why, the old sort of nightly news, New York Times, daily newspaper, wherever you live, phenomenon going away is it's still sad to those of us who spent most of our lives in the 20th century.
Totally, because it served a purpose for so long. Do you think that climate journalism still has a place in those larger spaces too?
Oh, sure. When big things are happening, I got to go to the North Pole and to Greenland, and we all can't do that. I can reach out to people in Greenland now and run a webcast on it, but there is some benefit to being there for sure. And that aspect of these institutions of journalism is still important. There is a role for that, for the BBC, for the New York Times, for NPR, and the rest. Once you get toward making people safer facing climate change, giving people opportunities to harvest resources for clean energy, it's less and less clear how the old model of something like the New York Times can do that.
Off that point, the rise of misinformation too, it feels like every reader now has to have this additional lens as they're consuming of looking out for these watchwords, really scrutinizing what exactly that means.
And pausing before you click, pausing before you share. And half the time, more than half the time, thinking about what's called confirmation bias. How much of what attracted you to a headline is based on your own preconceptions? And are you just sharing something because it's been artfully designed to fit into your head in a way that makes you go click?
Right. It's popping up on your screen for a reason, right? And that's not nearly as random as it once used to be. Well, you've talked about, these watchwords in your newsletter as well, and have mentioned a few others like developing versus developed versus underdeveloped. Which words are journalists getting better at using correctly, and where are they still falling short?
Well, I have a big difference of opinion with the Guardian newspaper, which in their style book, now it's not like a hard prohibition, but they say their journalists shouldn't use climate change. They should use climate breakdown or climate emergency. Don't say climate crisis unless you're really going to get specific about what you mean. Uncertainty is something journalists really have a hard time with. It is part of this landscape. Sea level rise by 2100 could still be 3 feet or it could be half a foot. And that all depends on some seriously uncertain science about ice sheets that I don't see being resolved anytime soon. When someone uses the phrase doomsday glacier, talk to an actual Antarctic scientist about what they mean when they say collapse. Collapse is a great example. Collapse, ice sheet collapse. It just Google for my name, Revkin, and the word collapse in Antarctica. And anyone listening can find some examples of how that's been abused.
So I think in talking about climate and journalism, we would be remiss not to talk about some of the key things that the fossil fuel industry has been consistently trying to pepper into its own communications. The main things that we see consistently are greenwashing, so promoting false solutions, distracting and delaying from concrete or credible action, and also paltering, which is using statements that are technically true, but also leave out a critical nugget of information in order to mislead the audience. How well do you see climate journalists, and I'll also add consumers, how do you feel that they're doing at combating those deceptive practices?
These techniques are really hard to defeat. As journalism is shrinking, the level of expertise in newsrooms is shrinking. The longevity of the reporters on beats is shrinking. And it's easier to get conned. And this is just as true for a company fighting zoning in a wildfire zone as it is for an oil company or real estate developers. You see this in many PR campaigns. There's a woman at the University of Rhode Island, Renee Hobbs, a professor who teaches propaganda literacy. I had her on my show twice. She's fantastic. There's an open online curriculum for becoming cognizant of what is propaganda. And that's the first step. I think systemically, if we change what kids learn in school, how do you think critically in an online media environment should be a fundamental part of early education now. There are news literacy curricula and the like. The question is how widely can they be distributed? And so you can recognize when someone's conning you, whether it's about the emissions from oil company activities versus the emissions of their material they sell us. It's not easy, but it's doable.
For people that are listening that want to be more discerning consumers of climate journalism, what do you see as some first steps and building blocks to learning more about this world and how to be a more conscious consumer of climate information?
Things to watch for are when people are tossing emblematic language around more than actually informing you. I'll circle back to climate emergency, climate crisis. Just take that little pause, finding your own mental methodologies for feeling when you're starting to react to something emotionally, either again as positive or a negative. learning that that's a signal to pay attention to and say, well, what do they mean when they say collapse? And then you see, oh, real geologists and glaciologists are talking about multi-century processes when they say that. And it's not like a building collapsing. That can then take you deeper into a story. And almost always in those articles, you'll see down deep, there's something about the time scale. Global Press is an international organization, a news organization based in DC, globalpress.co, that runs an international network of female journalists in developing countries. They do wonderful work. I've had them on my show a couple times. They train the journalists from the ground up to avoid using terms without checking twice. The word refugee gets tossed around and it has a specific meaning in the UN. And not everyone who's in motion is a refugee. Not everyone who's in motion is a migrant. They have a style book that's not like the AP or New York Times style book. It's more of a dynamic living document. It's about developing a habit in your newsroom of not just using phrases that also can be very disparaging. You're labeling somebody. She was a refugee, when in fact it might be a young woman who's seeking a better life in Dhaka, Bangladesh, after living on the coast in a vulnerable place. She doesn't see herself as a refugee. I would like to spread their style book method widely too.
I'd like to hear too about your own work. So if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit more about what your current projects are, how people can find them, and what's been exciting about the work that you've been working on recently.
Well, I'm sort of retired. Haha. Writers never really retire. They just kind of fade away. Like what excites me every day is in running my Substack thing, and more so the webcasts that I started when I was at Columbia and I still do. I think I can bring some nuance and some solution focus to issues that come through the news pipeline in ways that you'll never see in an article. The conversations that I've held, what I love about them is when necessary, they're global. I'm working on one right now on why so many people are stacked up on Mount Everest and what the conditions are there that are changing. And I'm going to have on a Sherpa, a female Sherpa, and a journalist in Nepal and another one in India. That's magical to me.
That's fantastic.
Works on local issues too. I'm here in Maine now, and coastal erosion is a big problem. I'm planning one on someone who has a living shorelines project. So how do you build shorelines that evolve with sea level, giving us more time to reinvent our relationships to coastal living and onward. You name an issue, I can pull together people, not just based on my experience, although it helps to have 40 years and thousands of contacts to draw on. But more so, what I hope is to like propagate that method of communication. So it's not just me finding ways to hold little conversations online and in person that can kind of drive things forward. That's the frontier that I feel is a really good fit for the nature of the problems we're all talking about.
So you talked about your show a few times. What is Sustain What?
Sustain What started early in the pandemic, and it's a series of webcasts that stream to wherever video streams. They're conversations where complexity and consequence collide, like all the issues we think about, but also more like earthquake resilience and the like. And it reached several million people. I've had on more than 1,500 guests over 4 years and 500 of these.
A lot of our conversation has coalesced around the idea of smaller news outlets and smaller audiences in communities and in other spaces, which I think to a lot of people is contrary to how they traditionally perceive media as being the nightly news, these major news networks like the New York Times that you used to work for, and watching TV at the end of the night and getting all of our information in that way. So can you speak a little bit more on how that shift has come about from the larger mainstream spaces for communication and conversation to these more niche areas, and also your own personal experience in transitioning from one space to the other.
The New York Times was like an amazing bully pulpit, to use Teddy Roosevelt's phrase. I felt a certain level of power, and certainly the institution did, as being the authoritative place people would go to really know what's happening. When I was there, though, I started to realize the limits of that model. I was in the newsroom when the Iraq War was getting into gear, and the Bush administration kind of sold the New York Times on a bill of goods about chemical weapons and the like. And the power of the New York Times to control that, to drive a narrative and not really be critically examining it, was troubling to me. One reason in 2007 I created my blog .earth was it felt like a better way to interrogate tough questions like climate change and other issues like that, where it wasn't all about a narrative. It was about conversation, about community, about me listening and not just being this sort of pundit, New York Times voice. And when I left the Times, that felt like a step away from a lot of the power. People say, well, you're from the New York Times, people answer your phone calls. That's true. So you're giving up power when you leave an institution like that. But I still feel overall the model that I've been pursuing, which can be, again, infinitely replicable across humanity, getting people to engage in conversations past labels, looking at each other as human beings first, and then starting with what the needs of a community are, how that relates to big global issues, has more potential to generate progress than relying on those top-down institutions, including places like the New York Times, to do the heavy lifting for us.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's a perfect place to wrap. Andy, thank you so much again for joining us and for the very fine work that you do.
Thanks for your time, and good luck with the work you do.
That's it for this episode of Climate Check, Stories and Solutions. Thanks for listening. To subscribe, go to climatecheck.fm. Climate Check is a production of 350 Brooklyn in Brooklyn, New York. Stay up to date with our releases by following 350 Brooklyn on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Our production team is George Ostro, Eva Dean, and Evelyn Mole. That's me. Our research and writing team is Mimi Bluestone, Audrey Stanton, and Megan Eisenberg. Eva Dean is the executive producer with co-leader Audrey Stanton. The music you heard in this episode is from Blue Dot Sessions. 350 Brooklyn is a local affiliate of 350.org, a worldwide grassroots climate organization. Join us in finding solutions to counter climate change.